Program. I'm Susan Elliott. I'm the President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and I'm really pleased to welcome all of you to participate in today's discussion. As you know, today's program will be focused on lessons from Northern Ireland learned and how to tackle the climate and biodiversity crisis. We are really fortunate to have two experts from Northern Ireland, Donal Griffin and Rosalind Skillen, who will share their perspectives on the crisis situation. Both Donal and Rosalind were participants in the National Committee on American Foreign Policy's Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Program. And for those of you who aren't familiar with our program, the NCAFP launched the Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Program in 2023 with our objective to be empowering the next generation of leaders shaping the future, not only in Northern Ireland, but to strengthen also the transatlantic relationship. Participants are community leaders, scholars, activists from diverse backgrounds and experiences across Northern Ireland. So we're really pleased to have Donal and Rosalind here with us today because they're going to share their thoughts on how lessons from Northern Ireland can help shape transatlantic strategies for dealing with the climate and biodiversity crisis. Today, we will explore practical ways to strengthen collaboration across the Atlantic while we try to address these urgent issues. And we're also pleased to have the National Committee on American Foreign Policy's Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Program Director Emma DeSouza. She's going to moderate the discussion with Donal and Rosalind. So I think we're in for a really good hour of sharing ideas. Before I turn the program over to Emma, I just want to remind all the participants that we will allow time at the end of the program for Q&A after the initial discussion. So if you look at your screen down at the bottom, just a little bit to the right of center, there's a Q&A box. And if you have a question, type it in and the participants will be able to see your questions, and to the best of our ability, we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. So anyway, I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank you, Emma and Rosalind and Donal, for taking the time to share your thoughts with us today. So over to you, Emma.
Thank you so much, Susan, and welcome everyone. Delighted to have you here to join us in this conversation. As Susan says, we are keen for this to be an interactive session, so please do use the option of being able to put in a question to the Q&A, and we will get to your questions towards the end of this discussion with Rosalind and Donal. Delighted to have Rosalind and Donal with us. They were both in the Year 1 cohort for the Emerging Leaders Programme. And what I'd like to do to get us started is actually to ask both Donal and Rosalind to give us a little bit of information about their policy paper, and then we're going to go to the question, which is what they can really tell us about the present challenges in advancing climate and sustainability policies. So I'm going to come to you first, Donal. Please introduce a little bit of background to your policy paper and this first question around what you can tell us about the present challenges.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you, Susan, as well. So my name is Donal Griffin, and I'm an environmental advocate and campaigner and lobbyist, you might say. I work in the marine environment. And however, my policy paper was slightly different, although connected to that. It was around the idea of future generations, decision making, future generations thinking, and more specifically, about the policy paper, we focused on how we could progress a Future Generations Act in Northern Ireland. So a new law that would kind of mandate that future generations perspective in Northern Ireland. And I was actually looking back at my proposal, my very first proposal from, seems like a long time ago now, and I have at the top of it I had put the vision. So, and I think I might just very quickly read that out because it's actually interesting for me to read it back now, actually a few years on. So what is the Future Generations Act for Northern Ireland? What would that deliver? What's the vision of that would deliver? And I had said that the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly consider and account for the impact of their decision making on future generations and the environment, not solely the immediate and short-term implications of policy, strategy and law, and that this would lead to better societal outcomes, not only for future generations, but itself have positive and just outcomes for those struggling in today's society also, and that the long-term consideration of policy and law making begins to restore faith in the currently failing political institutions in Northern Ireland. And that was written in the context of the Northern Ireland institutions, the Stormont institutions, power sharing institutions in Ireland actually not working at that moment in time. They were collapsed, and we were without devolved government in Northern Ireland at that time. So I think hopefully that sums it up a little bit. And then I guess just very quickly, practically what that means then, I suppose it's about encapsulating in law that future generations' decision making and perspective, and kind of enshrining long termism into how we make decisions in Northern Ireland, and eradicating to an extent possible short termism, which I feel is a prominent feature of our governance here in Northern Ireland decision making. So I think that hopefully that sums it up.
Thank you very much, Donal. Rosalind, come on in and tell us a little bit about your policy paper.
Yeah, it does feel a long time ago now. But I wrote about environmental peace building, which is quite a niche term. So I'll do the same as Donal, and I'll just talk through how that's actually defined. So the definition of environmental peace building is the process through which environmental challenges shared by former parties to a violent conflict are turned into opportunities to build lasting cooperation and peace. So really, my paper centered around this question of how can cooperation around the environment actually incentivize peace and good relations. In my opinion, the two are mutually reinforcing. And a lot of people will agree that environmental action is transboundary by nature. You know, birds don't know borders, for example. But then translate that into the context of the island of Ireland, for example, where you've got like a border there, and obviously there's pollution, the issue of water, like all these things that were discussed in the Good Friday Agreement, how peaceful relations actually impact the environment. These are all the questions that I'm considering in my paper. Really highlighting that it's the physical environment that can highlight the common ground between people, like literally the common ground beneath our feet, that highlight shared identities. And even when like Donal, for example, just introduced himself as like an environmentalist, an environmental advocate. That's like a really broad umbrella term. So again, the environment provides people with a means to identify in these really broad categories without putting yourself into necessarily like political or religious categories. And that's the lens through which we typically kind of like put people in these boxes in Northern Ireland. So, you know, terms like water protectors, place protectors, environmentalists, like all these are much broader ways at looking at things and challenges that are kind of shared. So then in my policy paper, there were three main recommendations. The first one was about creating neutral spaces for environmental cooperation, in particular community gardens. There's a lot of cross-community gardens in Northern Ireland, so small kind of allotments or gardens located along like peace lines, for example. And I was taking the recommendation from another charity called Social Farms and Gardens in Northern Ireland. They're advocating that the 11 council areas should provide the equivalent of 5 fully sized allotment plots. The second recommendation was about providing ring-fence funding for cross-community collaboration. And I looked at successful examples of other NGOs in the UK, Ireland and Northern Ireland that have looked at peatland restoration and other cross-border biodiversity projects, and where they've worked really successfully together for a shared environmental outcome. And then the third policy recommendation was developing a joint statement from the Northern Irish Assembly on environmental peace building. So really kind of going from the local with the first recommendation to the national, and all parties kind of embedding this way of thinking, therefore in the way that they make decisions.
Thank you so much, Rosalind. And I wonder if I can expand on that a little bit. So if you can tell us just a little bit more about what role the environment can play in advancing peace, reconciliation, and well-being, and whether that is something that can be applied in other jurisdictions, such as somewhere like the US.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like, even when you think of the Atlantic Ocean, that's the ocean that in some ways separates two continents, but also connects like the people who are potentially on this call. It provides a home for species like seabirds. We know that US seabirds use it. We know that Irish seabirds use it. So again, you've got that kind of shared goal. And that's when I think about environmental peace building, that's how I think about it in terms of like, really what's an area for pragmatic, practical cooperation, and to really define what we're defending. In many cases, it's like the commons, so land, water, shared resources. And on the flip side, we see what happens when you don't have environmental peace building, and when the environment therefore accelerates conflict, and can kind of spark conflict, whether it's water wars, whether it's arguments over land. And we know in Northern Ireland, land has been like a defining issue for tension in generations. And it's looking at areas of national concern, but then more broadly, areas of global concern. And every year there's climate conferences, countries getting together to discuss the environment. So yeah, really looking at how the two intersect, how they're mutually reinforcing, and how different countries, including the US, can embed this way of thinking in the way that they think about policy. Because as you said, Emma, there's so many more broad benefits, not just the environment. And I think that's also important to highlight how, yes, you're potentially boosting biodiversity, you're potentially reducing carbon dioxide emissions, but much more broadly, you're also enhancing good relations, well-being. There's a lot more social benefits, and economic benefits as well, to kind of be realized.
Absolutely. And Donal, I wonder if I can come back to you on this sort of transatlantic aspect and ask about this Future Generations Act concept. So what does that look like in practice a little bit more? And is this, as I said to Rosalind, something that could be transferred and applied to different jurisdictions such as the US?
Yeah, so just coming back first then to my policy paper itself, it was a legislative proposal, so it was kind of exposing the benefits of an actual law. But I'll get on to I'll first kind of say what I had proposed, but I guess the main point is that future generations' decision making can come in many shapes and sizes and forms when you talk about how decisions are made. And I suppose on one end of the spectrum, you have a law, and my legislative proposal was at that end of the spectrum. But you also have, future generations' values, priorities, perspectives, and if they can be incorporated one way or another into whatever decision is being made at any level, then I think that has the potential to have really good, just, fair, and improved outcomes, and prospects in terms of health and well-being and all sorts, socially, economically, across environmentally. But my legislative proposal really was based on two strands or pillars, if we want to use those words in keeping with the Good Friday Agreement. So at first, it would create an independent Future Generations Commission. And this would lead public and civic education, outreach, and engagement of future generations and decision making, as well as mandatory reporting to government, kind of like marking the government's homework in a sense. And then it would also create a ministry for future generations to guide and oversee the transition to and implementation of future generations' perspective and long-term policy and decision making in Northern Ireland's executive, in the Assembly, and also the public bodies as well. So, I mean, at the very top level, that's kind of what the proposal was based upon. And then within the Future Generations Commission, I mean, I'll not go through it all, but a part of that then is about establishing principles of sustainable development to which public bodies and government must adhere, establishing a statutory duty to cooperate for present and future generations. That statutory duty to cooperate is something that there are conversations happening in Northern Ireland about that outside of the future generations context, but is super relevant, I believe. And also about I guess marking the homework of government in terms of its future generations implementation and scrutiny and accountability as well. And then in terms of the Ministry for Future Generations, I suppose then it's about having that representation in the Northern Ireland Executive, in the Assembly, in terms of advocating for that future generations perspective. It would also champion and progress then other policy and law in whatever sphere across the whole devolved realm of what we can legislate for in Northern Ireland, whether it's policy, strategy, new primary legislation to deliver that change required to effectively, deliver the Future Generations Act. And that's kind of, as I said, that's on one end of the spectrum, but around the world, there are lots of different versions of this future generations decision making. I mean, another example of a law is actually Wales. So they were leaders in this field world round, actually, in implementing the Future Generations and Wellbeing Act back in 2015. But there are other countries that have established commissions or they have progressed policy, future generations decision-making policy, or they have established um, civic forums, something that I know, Emma, you're very interested in terms of future generations and how governments can kind of more incorporate long-termism and get out of this the short term and sometimes which proves a trap or a pitfall of short-termism in electoral cycles. Um, and in terms of the US, just the third aspect of your question there, and how it could be progressed in the US. I mean, I am not a US expert by any stretch, so far be it from me really to be making any recommendations. But it does strike me that the US is, it's federated in nature. There's lots of states and there are lots of levels of governance. So from my perspective, there are lots of levels, therefore, of opportunities to enshrine this future generations decision making or perspective or values and priorities into decision making, and whether that's at a federal level, that would be a big ask, I'd imagine. I don't know what others might think. At a state level, okay, depending where you are, still maybe a big ask, or maybe no matter where you are. But even at the county level or the district level or whatever other levels there are, and even I think at a small scale, I think this idea of future generations thinking um, is critically important. And I think at whatever level that it can be introduced, the better. And I think also that maybe starting from a bottom-up approach is not a bad idea either. My proposal was very much a top-down, and that's actually one of my own criticisms of my own paper is that it's a bit top down, and as an environmental advocate, I like to see them both meet in the middle. I like to see that bottom up aspect, and I like to see it being met then with the top down. So I think there's lots of opportunities, and it's really and there's no limit or restriction on the way that future generations and long termism can be enshrined. It's up to our own imagination in a lot of respects.
That's great, Donal, and I love your optimistic view of the bureaucratic federal system within the US. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
about opportunities.
Yeah,
That's
exactly
great.
right.
But I want to come back, Rosalind, and I'll come to you about this too, Donal, and just ask you to give us a little bit on what you can tell us about the present challenges in advancing climate and sustainability policies, both in Northern Ireland and globally. We'll start with you first, Rosalind.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel in Northern Ireland there's just the constant challenge, and it's not unique to environmental policy. It's across all areas of policy, just in terms of like stable governance. And I think long periods of collapse of any institution, it's just not conducive to any progress on any policy area. So I think that's something which I talked about in my paper. And it was true kind of in our cohort of whatever topic we were talking about. Like you do just need stable social democratic governance. And I think that's really important to highlight. Um, and in terms of the other challenges, I guess as far as I see it in Northern Ireland and Ireland, there's a really strong community and voluntary sector, really good NGOs. For example, in Ireland, there's like 400 men's sheds registered with the Irish Men's Shed Association, and they're a leader in men's sheds worldwide. And those are, again, just like community groups for men to come together and sometimes to do environmental action, but other things as well. And the NGO sector has a really strong voice, but at the same time, it's like really under-resourced. So I feel like often a lot of the advocacy, as Donal was saying, kind of falls on the shoulders of the community and voluntary sector a wee bit. And I think that is a challenge. Donal also mentioned the nature of like 4-year electoral cycles. I think that's really hard because, again, like people do fall into short term rather than long term thinking. And in many ways, politicians are rewarded like at the ballot box when they do things short term as well. So I think that, yeah, that requires like a more long term sort of vision. Um, and finally, I just think that we're operating in a really squeezed political context. There's so many things going on. And I think that's really difficult because in many ways the environment is something long term, it's chronic, it's not acute. And I think that enables people to push it down the line. I would say that it's important to tie it to like other policy areas, because I don't necessarily think it is something long term. I think we're living through like the sixth mass extinction, and we know how nature depleted Northern Ireland, the island of Ireland is, but I think that definitely is a challenge when you're kind of thinking about environmental action and when you're trying to introduce these policies. It's a lot easier to roll back on them, because there's something maybe more immediate. That, yeah, politicians are aware of as well.
And what kind of policies would you suggest linking it to? Would that be things like housing, healthcare? Like, what would your suggestions be around possible policies that can be linked?
We definitely think health is a massive like untapped potential, because I think take the issue of like air pollution, for example, obviously really bad in terms of carbon dioxide, but also related to public health. And even, yeah, in Dublin, for example, there's a load of stuff to do with the Dublin airport, them expanding their flight paths, and a lot of the campaigning against that, it's like not really to do with the environment, it's just to do with like residents, their houses are shaking, or the noise, like they can't sleep at night, breathing in dirty air. So I definitely think the health angle is really strong as well. You see it not only with air quality, but like water quality, because no one wants to swim in like dirty water. And obviously Donal's much more better position to speak on this because he works for an NGO that represents marine protection. But again, like a lot of the people who would kind of campaign and support that kind of legislation, it's not necessarily to do with the environment, it's very much to do with the fact that they want to enjoy clean places to swim, or they've inhaled something like toxic, or their dogs have died. Like there was that big story in Northern Ireland where the dogs were dying when they were in drinking water in Lough Neagh. And I saw an article recently, actually it was really good, about like how we actually need more swimmers in our rivers across the island of Ireland, because again, like when you've got more people swimming in it, then there's more leverage for people to have it designated as like a clean bathing space, and then there's impetus on the government to look after it, which I think is really interesting. So yeah, to answer your question, I think health is definitely one, and Irish Doctors for the Environment are another campaign group that do a really good job at talking about this. So I think that message is again one to kind of champion.
Very good, thank you very much. Donal, I want to
Just-
bring you in on this. So, first, can you tell us a little bit about your view on some of the present challenges, both in Northern Ireland but also globally? And then maybe pick up on that point that Rosalind was talking about here about the potential to try and advance these issues by linking them to other policies.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the last aspect first because I couldn't agree more with Rosalind there. And what I was thinking as you were speaking, Rosalind, was I was it was a couple of months ago now. I was at an evening dinner talk, and it was called Ocean Dinner in Dublin that we helped facilitate, and we basically it's a load of people interested and passionate about our seas and what and biodiversity in it. And we have dinner, and we have invited a speaker to kind of over dinner, talk about a specific aspect of ocean conservation or maritime history or culture, these sorts of things. And we had a fantastic speaker a couple of months ago, a retired professor from university in Galway, speaking about the mental health, the physical and mental health benefits of the sea, and really getting into the intricacies and the research behind like why do we feel so good about ourselves when we go in for a sea swim? You know, or like why do I feel so good about myself when I just even walk along the beach? I don't even have to touch the water, but the smell is restorative for me. The smell of the sea is restorative for me. And like why is that? And it kind of speaks to Rosalind's other point there as well about, the more people that are in the water or along the water or on the water or under the water, the more advocates you have for its protection, because it is the people that go into our coastal waters day in and day out that notice the change in their normally a very small patch of their coast or their their little oasis normally, and they want to protect it, and they notice the difference. Well, if it's going in a bad direction, then often they are energized to protect it. So I completely agree with Rosalind on all of that. And the mental health, particularly, that benefit of being in the sea, and not just the sea, by the way, as well, but there's been research showing that that connection with nature can really benefit people's mental health, and is for a lot of people, they incorporate connecting with nature and connecting with the sea into their routine of, keep maintaining their mental health. Um, and in terms of the obstacles, I suppose, to better outcomes in terms of climate and biodiversity and sustainability and all these things, I always bring back to willingness from government and prioritization by government. I always lead with that, because when it comes to these global issues, of which climate change and biodiversity loss are, they're hyper local, of course, but they are also global. And it's only with the proper buy-in and support and leadership from world leaders and from countries, that we can actually move the dial on these issues, especially climate change, but also especially our seas, to bring it back to the marine environment again, because there's one ocean in the world. It's all connected. Every part of every ocean out there is all connected to the other. So it really is a global issue in that sense as well. And there I think we've been through a bit of a roller coaster in terms of that willingness or that commitment from governments worldwide. I feel like in the 2000, before COVID, let's say, the pre-COVID era, that genuine willingness from government, they had to be dragged and kicked and screaming there to that point, but they were getting to a point where there was felt like there was proper momentum globally for proper change. And obviously that started long before 2015 with the Paris Agreement. But, building on that, and also the Greta Thunberg momentum and campaign, and the school strikes all across Ireland, the UK, EU, and globally. Really, the involvement of young people really was a brilliant campaign, and I felt like we were getting somewhere in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of not just the rhetoric, but in terms of action. And then, of course, COVID came along, priorities completely changed. Environment went right, the priority of the environment went right down to the bottom of the ladder again, where it has been for a very long time. And quite rightly, of course, COVID was a huge thing that we had to really mobilize and against, and do all sorts of things differently in the world. Um, and now, and since then, we have, let's just say, Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo. You have war zones, humanitarian disasters all around the world. Throw into that then, partly because of some of these issues, cost of living crisis, energy security issues, tariff wars. All these things then are just automatically jump the priority list up over and above the environment again. And again, quite rightly, not that that's wrong, but the environment, as Rosalind was saying, is the long-term chronic issue. And I have family members with long-term chronic health issues, and they're still with us. But their quality of life isn't great, I would say, and I think that's a good kind of comparison there. And in some cases, they know that that chronic condition will kill them, and that's the stark reality of the climate change and biodiversity crisis we're in too, and we really need to act now. So I think the biggest barrier is that genuine commitment from government and world leaders. However, that all sounds quite pessimistic, but what I will say is that despite having said all of that, we're probably in a position now where we've never had so much investment in time, resources, and energy in tackling our climate change, in tackling the biodiversity crisis, and that is something to be hopeful about. The real question is it enough? And my view is that it's not. We need to do much more. So there's a bit of pessimism in there, I think, or realism maybe, but I think there's a bit of optimism in there too about, over COVID, all the hundreds of years of the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and pro scientific endeavor and progress mobilized in a very short period of time to come up with vaccines essentially that saved the lives of literally millions and millions and maybe even billions of people, if COVID had a raged through the world completely kind of untempered by vaccines. What we need now is a similar mobilization of effort and energy and bringing together of all the world's and all the people's scientific, cultural, social, economic progress for the past how many hundred years to really tackle this problem properly. It's not beyond, or in my view, it's not beyond us to do that.
Mhm. And I wonder, well, first I want to say thank you to the people putting questions into the Q&A. Please do use that function because we're going to come to your questions now shortly. So you'll see there on your screen the option to put in a question to the Q&A and encourage as many of you to do that as possible. I want to pick up a little bit here on, you're talking there about the importance of kind of legislative leadership as well, Donal, and I wonder, if it is particularly challenging when you have an administration within the United States who perhaps does not prioritize climate policy and the potential ripple effects that can have globally with the US being such a significant leader. And how do we get around that? Like, I know both you and Rosalind have significant experience at a community-based level and a grassroots level. So is there potential for that kind of transatlantic cooperation, transatlantic coalition on trying to empower communities in the absence of an administration that will prioritize these topics? And how can people go about creating those coalitions?
Yeah, that's good. That's a big question. And yeah, it does. It undoubtedly does when US, a global leader, like that, kind of pulls back from climate commitments, biodiversity commitments, pulls away or retracts from green energy commitments, all these sorts of things, which absolutely need to happen and will happen, and that they will happen in time. Like the climate itself will force us to act, at some stage. The sooner we act, the better. But so. It's really a delay is what's happening now as opposed to a stoppage in my view. But it's where that delay pushes us over the edge, and the tipping point is the real issue. And in terms, and just I suppose in the Northern Ireland example, we have quite strong climate law now. It was passed a few years ago. It's actually starting to be tested in courts and all in the courts now in all sorts of ways, which is just a part of the process. That's fine. But we have quite strong law, and it came from, it was passed when we had a minister for the environment that didn't really believe in climate change. So so there are comparisons there to be made in the US as well. Um, but it was passed then, I guess, through the brilliant work of the NGOs and activists that Rosalind was a part of. Well done to Rosalind and her peers on that. And it also came about from really having a champion in the legislature. In our case, it was Claire Bailey from the Green Party that put forward her own private members bill that forced the hand of the minister that then drafted the department's own bill, but it was then it was followed up. Then it was turned more ambitious than it was originally drafted, which was good. So there's a bit of a compromise made there, but it was a good piece of legislation, and it was strong, I think, for Northern Ireland, and passed at a very short period of time in between the institutions haven't fallen. They were up again for like a year or so. The bill was passed as into an act, and then they shortly after they collapsed again. So it was really pivotal that they were passed in that short period of time. Um, so there, it's not we're not without hope in these things either. As I said, it was passed by a minister that has, at least in the past, has said that is it was a climate skeptic, climate change denier. So there is that. And in terms of, I guess, the transatlantic, I think there is opportunities for that transatlantic kind of peace building that Rosalind mentioned, but also like the in terms of that transatlantic cooperation, because as Rosalind nicely put it earlier on, we are neighbours. We're quite far away, but we looked. If you stand on the western seaboard of Ireland, you look out, you won't, but the next country that you'll see will be the US, and um, we share that Atlantic, and that Atlantic crossing has a lot of history in terms of the a lot of history, maritime history, social history, immigration history, and I think it would be good to recognize that, and not at the ground level, but it's something that I've been thinking about recently with a couple of meetings and conferences that I've been at. But there was currently being ratified as a global treaty called the High Seas Treaty. And when it is ratified by 60 countries, then it will allow for the establishment of marine protected areas, which is my bread and butter with my day job at Fair Seas, in the high seas, so in areas beyond national jurisdiction, something that isn't possible to do right now at the minute. And what if, Ireland and the US came together to progress the first ever High Seas MPA through the High Seas Treaty? Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be a world global example of leadership on the environmental front? Now, maybe that seemed like a long shot now, but things will change, and Trump will pass at some stage. Feelings in America will change to a lot of things in time. They always do, not just America, all over the world. And while I'm not optimistic of that happening, it's something that maybe we should start to think about seriously. And it's Trump doesn't stop these progress being happening towards those goals, and we shouldn't let him either.
Very good. That's great, Donal. That's a great idea. Rosalind, do you want to come in on this? How can we get around the barriers of political inaction by building coalitions, and can we do that on a transatlantic basis?
I would agree with Donal when he said about how like the green revolution is happening. It's like a choice whether you want to be a part of it. Because obviously the Trump administration first time around pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and there was still the progress that, I mean, slow progress, but that has got us to this stage now. And there will still be representation from civil society, from businesses, from investors at the climate conferences. So I think like that is also important to flag. And in terms of transatlantic cooperation, I mean, I just think more like with the escalating impacts of climate change, just more and more people are going to become aware and going to become involved. And I think that's really what's gonna kind of make it less of a niche thing to more of a mainstream thing. Like we're seeing now, I know it's discussed in a very specific way in the UK and Ireland, but with the heat wave in Europe and then like the flooding in Texas recently, all those kind of extreme weather events, it's prompting this conversation about like, oh, are we living in an uninsurable world? Oh, will people be able to go on holiday anymore? Like the fact that now it's changing the way people will holiday. They won't go on a summer holiday to Europe if you're living in Ireland or the UK. You'll instead maybe go during the winter, like all those things. And I know that's like a very narrow lens through which to look at it, but I think this conversation is happening. It's touching people just in more like in different ways depending on the context in which you live. I think it's difficult because in the US and in like the UK to a certain degree, like we're not experiencing the worst impacts of climate change yet. and I think that as well is what keeps it kind of at bay, or keeps the like
Mhm.
political discussion at bay. But I think programs like the one that we did, opportunities for people to come together and learn from each other are really important. Like you've got the like policy frameworks that Donal talked about, you've got the conferences that happen once a year to bring people together. So I think it is just a question of like keeping going, and just keeping keeping the hope as well, as Donal said. And I just thinking about like what agendas will drive us, and it's always surprising to me that like the environment is never kind of explicitly named as like an agenda. It's often kind of relegated to the side. But I think that will change. And I think it's just about kind of keeping on going and keeping the communication, the cooperation, and building on what we already have. I think a lot of the time things are happening informally, and it's just kind of a process of formalizing them in some ways as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I want to bring in some of the questions coming in through the Q&A. So I'm actually going to put 2 questions to you now. So first, I want to bring up the question from Lake, who has asked about the fact that obviously we've got a shared energy grid here on the island of Ireland. So, you know, is there any disparities in your view between Ireland and Northern Ireland in terms of national interests when it comes to energy? And also, do you see conflicts between the UK and Ireland when it comes to climate goals? And secondly, if I could also ask for you to respond to Masuma's question, which is looking at green financing. So asking if green financing might be a reason why some politicians may not consider investing environmentally in the long term. So Rosalind, do you want to go first?
I don't think I'm best placed to take the first question because I'm not an energy expert. Maybe Donal can talk to that one with the renewables. But in terms of the second one, the green financing, I don't think financing is a reason why people might not consider investing environmentally. Perhaps like on the flip side, like lobbying from fossil fuel companies or other big corporations representing different energy interests might be more of a reason why politicians are not moving. And I think that's something as well, which is a tricky one in terms of often when you're thinking about questions of like energy, food, all these things, often you're hearing it through the filter of like a very large corporation, and not often the kind of the local groups, the communities, the grassroots. But I definitely think that we do need to see like an uplift when it comes to ESG investment and green financing. I think companies need to be rewarded, and citizens as well need to be rewarded for doing the right thing. Because I think when the finance flow isn't there, then like people just won't do it. And like an example, I guess it's a very small example, but looking at sort of like successful ESG or like financing in the south recently, in terms of people getting compensated for doing the right thing, the environmentally positive thing. We've got the deposit return scheme in the south, where people, if they have their plastic bottle or their can and they return it, and they get 25 cents. And again, it's like, it sounds small, but it's all those things that are really important, and that do incentivize people. So I think, yeah, the green financing is just not there, like to the extent that it needs to be. But yeah, I definitely think like corporate interest is one factor that is maybe preventing politicians from doing more.
Thank you, Rosalind. Donal, do you want to come in on both Lake and Masuma's question?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Rosalind just said there. So I think I couldn't add to that. I completely agree. And then on the first question there about the air grid. So yeah, air grid is kind of so I guess in terms of where the Republic of Ireland is and Northern Ireland is in terms of energy, is that they're in the exact same place really, is that they want free and green, clean energy as much as they can get. That's been a bit flippant, but um, the big move now in the energy sphere is towards, offshore renewables, mostly solar as well, tidal, not so much, wave, not so much, little bits, but mostly it's solar and offshore renewable energy. And there are projects being developed in the Republic. There is a couple of projects being developed in the north. At the moment, Ireland actually imports a lot of energy from the UK. So there is, while they might not be, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland are not exactly maybe in the same place developmentally in terms of their networks and in terms of their indigenous generation of energy. They cooperate very well. And on the island as well, specifically, of course, there are north-south interconnectors. There are more north-south interconnectors, being developed as delayed, but are being developed as we speak. So I suppose it's not so much that their disparities are differing in national interests, or I mean, there probably are, of course, but it's not so much that that hasn't stopped actually quite a lot of collaboration on that front across the island. In a space, in a context where, and this has been going on for decades, in a context where in a lot of spheres there hasn't been that north-south kind of collaboration in a strange way. Um, but yeah, and just reading the last bit of it, do Irish and UK governments also clash on climate goals for the island? I don't think so. I mean, I think they work on climate goals. They probably work very independently, but there are discrepancies in terms of the exact targets in Northern Ireland and the exact targets down south, but we're all just pushing in the same direction. And because the sources of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions are pretty much the same north and south, I mean, that doesn't really change, that they're having to tackle the same issues north and south. So I'd say they're more independent as opposed to differing. They're independent working on the same issues, but like in just two different jurisdictions. Although there is, of course, the NGOs are some of the loudest voices for calling for more collaboration in tackling those things, because with water quality, with emissions and lots of things, they work on a scale that doesn't really logically make sense to differentiate along a man-made border.
Mhm. And I wonder, Donal, while I have you, if you might want to come in here on Grant's question. So he's asking a question
Yeah.
specifically about the Future Generations Act and whether it would be, building on Section 75 equality measures, and also would it have specific climate impact statutory obligations?
Yeah, well, funny, that's kind of where some of my idea for the for elements of the Future Generations Act came from, in terms of there are statutory statements. If the government are progressing new legislation, there has to be statutory statements on for the likes of equality. There's also regarding some things, there's like a rural assessment, which I know less about, but that was what was in my thinking when I was thinking, right, well, if we could have not so much a specific climate impact statutory obligation, although yes, I would not turn that away. But if we had a future generations impact statutory obligation, that's kind of what I was, and that's actually nice phraseology, which I might steal. Again, kind of explains it much better than what I have it in my policy paper. But that's exactly what I would like, and I would also like for that statutory obligation or statement, which is an assessment of any new policy that's coming forward. I would like then for the Commission to review it and critique it and be able to to submit then and comments on that and improvements on that that have to be considered then by the Commission kind of thing. That is kind of where I was getting to in my policy proposal. So you're absolutely right, Grant.
Very good. Thank you very much, Donal. Okay, I've got a question in now from Nancy Sodenberg. So Nancy has asked if we see any lessons learned from the recent setbacks, especially in the need to instill in the youth the necessary resilience, and asking, can a better solidarity with corporations emerge? So I'll come to you first, Rosalind, and then Donal, you can come back in.
Yeah, I guess if you think about it like at its most basic, like if, for example, Trump is stripping like environmental policy, then I guess it's embedding policy in a way that we talked about earlier, that it's linked to health, that it's linked to social policy, and it's kind of it seems again very niche, but I always like to use the example of the disposable vapes campaign in the UK, which has led to the ban of disposable vapes. And that was really fast that that ban came in since the campaign started. It was like just a year, which is mad because usually people are campaigning on an environmental issue for sometimes decades. But the reason that was so successful was because the campaigners not only talked about the environmental impact of disposable vapes in terms of like polluting the environment, also the fact that they're made with lithium ion batteries that can't be recycled, all these, or that have to be recycled at a very specific recycling plant. So it's not just as easy as putting it in your designated bin. But they also linked the campaign to health. They linked it to young people underage smoking these vapes and not knowing about the health impacts. And as a result, all the different corporations, all the different groups that backed it were so diverse, and they were from a range of vantage points, and they all had different interests, but they were kind of all united under the umbrella of this campaign. So I think when you're talking to Nancy's question about policy and the rollback, I think it's what we said earlier about just making sure that something is very like wide and mainstreamed, and that it's embedded then in such a way that it can't just be like upturned. And I think in terms of solidarity, I'm not really sure what that means in terms of better solidarity with corporations. If that just means working together more with corporations. Yeah. Well, in that case, like, yes, I guess it just depends on like the interests of like what corporations and making sure that you have the same like shared goal. Because obviously where corporations might differ from like community groups is whether like people are prioritized over profit, for example. So I think it's just important to be clear on that. But when it comes to the environment, yeah, it's like you need as many people on your pitch as possible, so you can't really afford to be choosy.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. Donal, do you want to come in on this question from Nancy?
Yeah, just on the last thing first again, seems my way tonight. There's a great initiative in the Republic of Ireland here called Business for Biodiversity, and there's another similar initiative as well, Business in the Community, which is a big environmental and climate focus. But basically, it helps businesses. Probably smaller scale than the larger corporations, but helps local and I suppose small and medium-sized businesses do the best they can to improve their sustainability, reduce their carbon footprint, reduce their environmental impact, and it seeks ways then to allow businesses to increase their positive biodiversity influence and impact through their, through the conduct of their business or through other means. So that's something that's been really well received in Ireland and is doing some great work. And then just on the what lessons can be learned from the recent setbacks. Yeah, I mean, I think there are, and one example I think is, and it's true to say in Northern Ireland that I just spoke about, but also in the Republic, is that, in the last few years, basically, north and south in the island, there's two sets of really strong climate legislation now. And they are there for good. They're there for good now, and they put legal requirements on every future government, no matter what their stance on climate or the environment. They put like legal duties on all governments to fulfill. And yes, we're not fulfilling them very well at the moment. We have lots of work to do. That's fair comment. But it's still there, and the government must be shown and must work towards meeting those targets and criteria and what have you. So I think that is a lesson in the sense that, as well as all the brilliant ground up work and activism that is so, so important that led to those strong bills and acts being passed, is that getting those over the line has been really key and will become really key as we go on as well. Because I mean, in reality, it wasn't that long ago that we weren't talking about solutions to climate change, or we weren't talking about whose responsibility is it, the aviation sector, is it the agricultural sector, is it the transport sector? We were talking about, oh, is climate change real? Do you know, it is as Rosalind said, climate change action and the need for climate change action and environmental action as well, sustainability, what have you, has all been mainstreamed. And I think that is really, really important. And just the point to say there in the need to instill in the youth the necessary resilience. Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think pretty much a lot of the young people that I talk to can tell me much more about climate change, than I know. And actually, it's the same with the environment, and it's the same me being a marine biologist. It's the same with any young person talking about sharks. They all seem to know way more about sharks than me, even though I've been volunteering with the Shark Conservation Group in Ireland for about 15 years. So I think they are all very well educated on these issues now, and I suspect that when we get another 5 and 10 and 15 and 20 years down the line, that our decision makers and our politicians will be a very different crop than what we've had in the past. They'll be much more aware of the realities of climate change, much more aware of the realities of biodiversity loss, and they will be much more proactive in ensuring that they're tackled properly. Or at least that's my view, at least.
Well, here you go. Donal, you're actually an optimist after all. So
Yeah.
we're wrapping up, but just with a very short answer. If I can get you to try and answer in about 30 seconds or less for each of you. I want to bring up Sean's question here because he has brought up the fact that, obviously Northern Ireland and the US have significant foreign direct investments in each other's countries. And with significant reciprocal investments, can the transatlantic FDI guidelines be used to mutually incentivize the private sector around the environment? So Rosalind and then Donal, short answers.
I mean, the short answer, I guess, would be yes, in the sense that they should be working together to incentivize the private sector vis-a-vis the environment. I think part of it as well is often we complain or remark on things that we don't like. And I guess that's something that I've learned to do over the years. Like if there is a policy or an investment that you do like, being like, oh yeah, no, that's great, that's what we want to do. So more of that can also then encourage investors to know that that is what we want. So more of it, please.
Thank you very much, Rosalind. Donal?
And yeah, absolutely, 100% a fantastic idea. And just to say that in an indirect way, the foreign direct investment that Ireland receives and creates such a surplus in Ireland does go a long way in terms of environmental and climate, because it actually funds then initiatives and projects and policy implementation and law implementation in Ireland, because Ireland is relatively flush with cash now compared to many other EU member states and other countries around the world. So we have the money now to do proper climate and biodiversity action, in the right way and fully resourced. But having a direct link there and like a conditions on foreign direct investment, if that's kind of what you were getting at, Sean, I love that idea.
Yeah, it's a good idea. All right. Thank you all so much. It has been an absolute pleasure. I want to thank Donal and Rosalind for taking the time to engage with us this evening in Northern Ireland. And I want to thank everybody who has joined us in the US this afternoon. Thank you very much for being a part of this discussion, for the excellent questions. And we hope that we can continue to engage with you in the future on the Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Programme. Thank you very much.